All right, so we're going to start today. We're going to cover some of the basics in terms of autotrophic nutrition, talk a little bit about pigments that are necessary for photosynthesis, and then we'll talk about an overview of the light-dependent and light-independent reactions of photosynthesis. And then tomorrow we'll actually get into the details of both of those. And so by the end of this period today, you probably will get a little bit of time to work on the homework that you're going to have for tomorrow. But you will need your workbook probably every day this week. Okay, so talking about photosynthesis and respiration, both processes that process energy in cells. We'll start by talking about photosynthesis, and then we'll move on to respiration after that. So first off, when we talk about photosynthesis, we're talking about nutrition, obtaining materials that are needed for the growth of an organism, for repair, for energy, for regulation. That's what nutrition is, gathering these materials that are needed to support life. And as we've talked about in the past, there's heterotrophic nutrition, autotrophic nutrition. In heterotrophic nutrition, organisms need to find material to adjust in some way to gain energy, whether that's hunting and eating something or breaking down dead material. Heterotrophs have to find organic matter to ingest to gain their energy. Obviously, animals are heterotrophs. Most protists, fungi, most bacteria, they all need to go and eat things in order to get energy. When we talk about photosynthesis, however, we're talking about autotrophic nutrition. And autotrophic nutrition is the ability that some organisms have that can synthesize their own organic materials, their own food, from inorganic materials. The word itself, auto means self, troph means having to do with food, means self-feeder. So obviously plants are autotrophs. Some bacteria are autotrophs, some protists, some archaea. We're going to spend our time talking about photosynthesis, but there are some organisms that can undergo a process called chemosynthesis, in which it doesn't require any light energy. They use other materials to convert inorganic materials to organic matter. Sometimes they use hydrogen sulfate, ammonium. And these are organisms, some things like tube worms that live in deep sea hydrothermal vents, can use other materials, some types of archaea, things like thermophiles that live in hot springs in these areas that were typically thought of as so inhospitable to life that nothing can live there, but we found that there are organisms that can live there, and many of them obtain their energy by chemosynthesis. Halophiles live in extreme salt conditions. Acidophiles live in extreme acidic conditions. And so some organisms can create organic materials that they use for energy using other things other than light. But we're talking about photosynthesis. We're talking about using light energy to produce organic materials. Okay. These are the tube worms that live in these hydrothermal vents and are able to go through this process of chemosynthesis. And then the archaea that live in these inhospitable conditions can do the same. So photosynthesis is basically the base of all food webs on Earth. Without photosynthesis, there would be no life on Earth. Okay? Because photosynthetic organisms will take light energy from the sun and convert it into a material form, into glucose. And there's a phrase that's important. And we've talked about this before. That when the foods that we eat contain energy, and where that energy is actually stored is in the bonds. Bonds contain energy. And so photosynthesis takes one form of energy, light energy, and basically captures that energy and stores it in a physical form, in the bonds between molecules of a glucose molecule. And then when we break those bonds, during other processes like respiration, the energy can be harvested, can be used. Okay? So the energy is stored in the bonds between molecules. Okay? Photosynthesis is a photochemical reaction. It's a reaction that requires light in order to happen. And photosynthetic organisms have different pigments that allow them to capture the energy from light. Okay? We think of what as the main pigment that allows plants to capture light energy? Chlorophyll. But there are others as well. So there are other pigments besides chlorophyll, and there are multiple types of chlorophyll, all of which can capture light energy. Okay? And so chlorophyll is the most common pigment used to capture light. There's several different types of chlorophyll. They're lettered, chlorophyll A, B, C, and D, and they each capture light of a slightly different wavelength. There are other pigments as well, though. There's carotene. Carotene is an orange pigment. It's what makes carrots orange. It's in an orange peel. Squash. The orange color of those comes from carotene. Pigment. There's xanthophyll, which is a yellow pigment. It's what makes bananas yellow. Back, here you go. You need to sit over here now. And anthocyanin is a red pigment. That gives tomatoes and beets their color. And these different pigments absorb light at different wavelengths to allow photosynthesis to take place. We'll do a lab in which we do chromatography, where we look at these various pigments that are found in plant extracts and separate them out using chromatography. We'll do that at some point this week. So we know, white light is actually made of various colors of the spectrum. Okay, and what are the colors? You learn them ever? Colors of a rainbow or what? What do you start with? Red, orange, yellow. Green, blue, indigo, and violet. Roy G. Biv. And so you see those colors, red to violet here. And when you look at a leaf, which colors does the leaf reflect? Green. Green. That's why a leaf looks green, because it reflects the green light. What that means is most of the green part of the visible spectrum is not actually absorbed by the pigments in the leaf. It's reflected. Okay? And this graph shows you the various pigments that are found, the common pigments, and you'll see that they each absorb light at a different area of the spectrum. Okay, that the chlorophyll A and B, down here in the bluest section, the carotenoids, that's carotene, and the other pigments here. And you say there's not a lot of absorption here in the green area of the spectrum. Okay? And so, in most of the growing season, the leaves on trees show green because chlorophyll is the most common and the dominant pigment. But as autumn approaches in our area, deciduous trees, that chlorophyll starts to break down. Okay, as trees are going to lose their leaves, the chlorophyll starts to break down, and some of the other pigments last slightly longer than the chlorophyll. And that's why as the chlorophyll breaks down, the color of the leaves changes. And that then you could see some of these other pigments that were always there in the leaf. Okay, the red pigments, the yellow pigments. Okay, they were there the whole time, but they were sort of masked by the abundance of chlorophyll in those leaves. And after the chlorophyll breaks down, you can see some of those other pigments, and that's why the trees in our area change color in the fall because of that. Eventually those pigments break down as well, and the tree actually loses its leaves. But it's the reason for the color change. So photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast, that is an organelle inside of cells. Okay. And the chloroplast, when we're looking at a large diagram of a cell, they're typically shown in green because they are green. And they look like a oval with these stacks inside of them, these little, kind of looks like a stack of pancakes or poker chips or something. And so those are the parts. So the few parts, the thylakoids, okay, those are those discs. Those discs, each individual one is a thylakoid. It's surrounded by a membrane, and the whole chloroplast is actually surrounded by a double membrane. And then the stacks of these thylakoids, like stack of poker chips there, are called the grana. And then there's a lot of space, a fluid-filled space around these grana. That's called the stroma. That is the fluid that's inside of the chloroplast. And in an actual, it doesn't quite look this neat when you look at an actual electron micrograph of a chloroplast. It looks more complicated, but you can see the stacks, the thylakoid membrane is here. See the stacks of those, the grana, and then the space around, that's the stroma. Okay, and the outside is the membrane surrounding the chloroplast. So to get an overview of photosynthesis, talk about the two steps. Hello? Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So as we know, the general equation for the process of photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide plus water, which produces glucose and oxygen. And there's some other things that are required. They're not a part of the actual equation because they're not used up and they're not rearranged to form new molecules, but it also requires chlorophyll, the pigment, requires lots of different enzymes, and it requires light energy for photosynthesis to take place. But they're not shown because they're not reactants. When we look at the chemical changes that happen in order to go from the reactants to the products, there's sort of two different phases of photosynthesis. We're going to call them the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions, although you will often hear them referred to with other terms. We'll talk about that. These are the light-dependent and light-independent are the more accurate way to talk about these, and we'll see why in a minute. But there's sort of two phases, okay? The light-dependent, they require light. That's why they're called light-dependent, okay? They also require water, okay, as a reactant, and they release oxygen. After the light-dependent reactions, there's the light-independent reactions, which take in carbon dioxide, okay, and requires several things that were produced in these light reactions, ATP, okay, NADPH, carbon dioxide, ADP. And those products are rearranged to actually produce the sugar. And so we see overall what's put into the system is water and carbon dioxide, and what's released from the system is oxygen and sugar. Okay? These other things are sort of internal to the system. So the light dependent, the light reactions are often called. They're called the photochemical reactions of photosynthesis. They require light, that's why they're called that. This happens in the grana, okay, so in the stacks of those poker chips that you see inside of a chloroplast. It requires light and it requires water. The end products of the light-dependent reactions are oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. The light-independent reactions, they're often, you'll see this in some of the worksheets we do, they're called the dark reactions, okay? But that's not really a great term because they actually don't happen in the dark, okay? They don't require light. That's why light independent is a better term for this. It's also called carbon fixation. It's called the Kelvin cycle, named after the scientists who sort of figured out a lot of this process, or the dark reaction. So all those terms mean the same thing, sort of. The light independent reactions do not require light. That's why they're light independent. They happen in the fluid, the stroma, the fluid around the thylakoids in the chloroplast. And they require ATP, okay? Requires NADPH, and it requires carbon dioxide. And the end product of the light independent reactions is the actual sugar that's produced during photosynthesis. And so over the tomorrow we'll be looking at the details of the light independent reactions and what's actually going on and how this happens. But for today we'll stop here.
Can you give us your homework?
Yeah, so you can have the next till the end of the period to start your homework.